How many times I've heard those words and read them. Cometh Mary Magdalene early on the first day of the week, when it was yet dark, unto the sepulchre, and the stone had been moved, and the tomb was empty. I mean, what a story. It's just like, what playwright could come up with such a plot? Just only the divine playwright could make such a story. And, all the disciples have been through such an extraordinary trauma, and they're all bound by the practices of the Jewish faith as it was at that time, that he was crucified on a Friday, and when the Sabbath started, which was the dusk, his body had to hurriedly be put into this tomb that was conveniently there, that a rich man came and got his body. Joseph of Arimathea got his body and put it in the tomb, but they couldn't do anything that they needed to do because no work can be done on the Sabbath, so he just had to be put away. So then the Sabbath comes, and what a Sabbath for these people. If you think about this as a real life experience and not as a myth. Many of us went through the death of Swami Kriyananda. What if Swami had been, instead of dying peacefully in his bed, suddenly, from one point of view, but nonetheless peacefully, if he'd been killed by an assassin or died in a bomb, he many times thought he might be assassinated. He thought that the antagonism that he'd generated among some of his fellow disciples might come in that way, but it didn't. But what if, someone that you very deeply cared for had been suddenly taken away? I mean, deeply cared for doesn't begin to say it. Suddenly taken away, killed in a terrible manner, and then the Sabbath descends, and you just have to stick his body in the cave and put the rock in front of it. None of the funeral rites, none of the rituals, nothing that you need. And then they had to live through, would it be 36 hours of the whole Sabbath, and then the next night? And imagine their state of mind. And also, they're terrified, in addition to everything else. There's the grief of what's happened, so unexpected and so different than they anticipated, because if you were here last week, remember, it was sing out Hosanna, here comes Jesus, and the very stones are ringing out, and this is the end of it. And they don't know whether Jesus is only the first, because all of them are known. Will the Roman cohort come crashing in at their doors one by one and drag them off to this horrible death? And they're trying, I'm certain, to go through their rituals and have their lives without knowing anything. Finally, the Sabbath is over, the night ends, and at the very earliest possible moment, Mary Magdalene simply cannot contain herself anymore. It's women who tend to move impulsively or be overwhelmed by their feelings. The feminine side moves like that. The male side is more considered. I'm not talking men and women. But it is appropriate that it's Mary Magdalene, that it's the feminine feeling that simply can't stand it anymore. So she runs to this place, and in her mind she's thinking, there's this big rock in front of this. How am I going to deal with this? And she's worried about it. She's probably been thinking about it all weekend, just imagining, seriously, you would, I would, making plans. How am I going to move the rock? How am I going to get access? How am I going to at least honor his body? But she comes and the rock is moved. That's the beginning. This is a huge stone and it's moved. And then she walks inside and looks inside this cave, and he had been wrapped in winding sheets. And the sheets were there, but they were piled exactly in such a way as if someone had taken them off. And in other accounts of the Bible, it says the wrap that was around his face was put somewhat separately, as if he took the body off and then he took the cloth off. Who knows? But this is how the account is told. But he's gone. And her first impulse, it's interesting, her first impulse is not that he's resurrected. Her first impulse is that his body has been stolen. And so that's what she says. She runs back to the other disciples and she says to them, they've taken away the Lord. because we don't first think of miracles. And the gospel hadn't yet been written, you know. They've taken him away. Because in fact, the priests who saw to his crucifixion were nervous because this rumor had been there that if you kill me, I will rise again. So they doubled the guard on the cave where he was buried because they thought that his own disciples were going to steal him. See, everybody distrusts everybody. This is the nature of the world. They thought the disciples were going to steal him, so they had it guarded. And then when he disappeared, they thought that the authorities had stolen him. Nobody is trusting, loving, believing anybody. Welcome to the human race, right? So they think he's been stolen. So there's, in this account, not all the parts are told, but it said that Simon Peter ran back and he heard her say it, but he had to see it with his own eyes. And then Mary Magdalene comes back again. She sees angels now in the tomb. Now there's angels sitting there. This is quite a morning, you know. That's why we celebrate it like this. She sees angels now in the tomb, and none of this is happening in calm contemplation. You know, they're running back and forth. She sees angels, and the angels just look at her in this, and now finally somebody is calm. They're very calm. And they say to her, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" You know, these divine questions get asked, don't they? And I'm sure she had to stop and think, well, the living, the dead? But that's how it looked to them. The angels are there, and from their perspective, the mere passing of a body has nothing really to do with life and death. Just as we would take on and off of the clothes that we're wearing, but we don't die because we've changed our outer appearance. What are you doing here in a tomb? What makes you think that this Christ consciousness that you have experienced through the life of this body, you think the mere killing of his body has anything to do with his consciousness? So of course Mary Magdalene is now a little bit confused. She comes away from there, from the angels, and she sees a man standing there, and it's such a human part. It was in fact Jesus himself, but he masked his consciousness. She did not recognize him. She thought he was, and I love this, the gardener. You know, like of all things, the gardener. She thought he was an official of the area, and he's there, and maybe he can help her. So in her desperation, she says, "They've taken away the Lord. Do you know where they've taken him?" And then Jesus smiles at her, and you can just feel just the power of the sweetness. And he just says, "Mary," like that, "Mary." And then all of a sudden, everything clears for her. And she looks at him and she says, "Rabbi," which is what she called him, "Master, it's you." And she falls at his feet and wants to embrace him. And imagine all of this. We start with the power of Palm Sunday, everything they think is going to happen, the extraordinary evening of the Last Supper in which Jesus, knowing for the last time, pours out to them all his love, all his teaching. He gives them everything he can because he knows what's about to happen. They go to the garden together, at the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus asks his disciples to stay awake with him and pray. And then they can't quite do it. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and they keep falling asleep. But Jesus knows what's coming, and he spends the whole night in prayer. And then he's arrested. He's humiliated. He's tortured. He's crucified. He dies. And Mary Magdalene watches all of this. And at the last, there finally, she asks the gardener, "Where is he?" And he says, "Mary." And then she knows. You know? And all that darkness, all that horrible intensity and despair and confusion and grief and not knowing anything what's going to happen, all God has to say is just that little word, her own name, "I know you." And when he knows her, She knows him. There's so many beautiful stories told in trying to give us images of how God holds us in his hand. There's a wonderful prayer of the footsteps in the sand, where during the most difficult, you see Jesus walking along next to you, and then you have these very difficult periods, and Jesus is, there only seems to be one pair of footprints, and then afterward Jesus says to you, oh, during that period of time I was carrying you. It was not possible anymore for you to walk on your own, so I had to carry you. Every story of spiritual life, every epic, every divine saga, it's always this intense experience of longing, desire, suffering, disappointment, pain, death, that does not always resolve so nicely in the span of time that we can see, isn't it? We imagine that God really wants exactly what we want, which is to make us comfortable so we can stay just the same. We have this strange desire just to hold on to whatever level of consciousness we have. It's, in my mind, I call it the preference for the known misery. However inadequate this experience may be, however painful these relationships may be, however disappointing this or that may be, the last thing we want is to have any of it change. We have it all plotted out, how we're going to, like this. And then God just watches us and says, I don't think so. I remember once when I lived in Ananda village and I went to work one morning in this office building worked on, which was a little primitive. That's the only thing I can say. We took down this big poster on the wall that had been there for a long time, and a whole family of bats was living behind it. It was a big picture of Master, and it was covering all these bats. And when we took the poster down, the bats started flying all around the office. I do not like bats. They were sort of being dissipated somewhere, and I was sitting in my office and I was writing like this, and a bat fell, like right there, just hit my hand and then fell next. I was pleased how I actually responded. Apparently, silently, I stood up, I picked up a cardboard box, I put it on top of the bat, and then I screamed. Just, blood-curdling terror. But first I protected myself from the bat. Just something completely other takes over. But in that same office building, I came to work one day and I was working on my typewriter, and there was this little spider. This little spider he was full of spunk. He had a lot of spunk. And he was running across the space bar, and it was, it wasn't an electric typewriter in those days. It was just like this. And he was running here, crossing the space bar. And I just became quite intrigued just watching him, because he had a lot of personality. And I realized that I was much bigger than the spider. And I was aware of the spider, and I had the feeling the spider was not aware of me. And I thought that I had the power of life and death over this spider. And I'm not fond of creatures sharing my space. So I was just going to say, I could just snuff your life out just like that. Not unkindly, but just get out of my space. Like this. And just like I'm thinking like this, right above me, I could feel this enormous presence of God and gurus. And I looked less than the spider. I loved that spider. He had spunk. I admired him. I didn't feel like God didn't love me or respect me, because I'm spunky too, And I think God has been more than amused by some of the things I've done over the years. But I saw so easily how we live by the power of God alone. And just as I held that life and death for that spider, so much more. We are held, life and death, in the hands of God. And all these little experiences that we anguish over for good reason, because oftentimes tremendous spiritual issues are really at stake. What do I believe? Who am I? What courage do I have? How much can I love? And it's really in these tiny little moments of our lives, dramatic events, even the most dramatic events in human history, are just a blip on the screen of eternity. But what is enduring is the consciousness that we develop through those little blips on the screen of eternity. So our every little thought that we think is extremely important to God and Guru. And Divine Mother is watching us very, very carefully. Just like a mother watches a child. A mother does not think it insignificant if her child is frightened or is cruel or doesn't have the courage to persevere. None of those little things go unnoticed. The mother watches very attentively. The father watches very attentively because it knows that the whole future of this soul will be determined by all of these little nuances. And so in our lives, we're running around like that little spider, and God is saying, let me help you. Let me help you find what you really want, not what you think you want. What we think we want, comfort, ease, desires fulfilled. Wouldn't it be nice if? And we make our little plans. I used to think of it, it's like a contract, just like little children play with their tea sets. I had a little tea set, and I remember, and every so often now you see these charming pictures. Usually it's pictures of big, strong fathers having tea with their little daughters, picking up these tiny little teacups like that, and all the teddy bears are lined up watching, and everybody's playing like this. This is a perfect picture of God in us. We have our little corporations, and we have our little jobs, we have our little art pieces, we have our little music, we have our health, and we work out over here, and God plays with us. He allows us to play. And just the way the father lets the daughter, put ribbons in his hair, and paint his fingernails, all those things, Divine Mother plays with us. And it's no sacrifice for the mother and the father to enter into that little world of the child. They love doing it. And when any of us see it, it warms our heart. It brings tears to your eyes to see that. I was very blessed in my own family. My mother and my father both were very dear. I remember my mother, I had naturally curly hair. And my mother had straight hair, and my mother loved my naturally curly hair. And every time she would wash it, she would call me over and she would say, honey, let me squinch your hair. And she would squinch it like this, and then it would all go in these little curls. Just little tiny things like that. I remember in the car with my father, we'd come home from a long trip, and he was a big man. And even if I wasn't asleep, I would pretend to be asleep, because then he would carry me in, And these are such small things, aren't they? But they tell us, and if a human parent, with all the cares that they bear, can give such loving attention, human birth, as Swami said once, is something, but divine birth is everything, as Master said. And think about how Divine Mother cares for us. And she watches us play out all these necessary karmic cycles. And she walks with us. And Guru walks with us. And when the fire comes, because unfortunately, not all our choices are good ones. And even though we want them to be good ones, we want this to be true, we want it our way. I was starting to say, I feel sometimes, especially when we're young, we write out this contract. This is what's going to happen in this incarnation. And some teachings which are well-intended, but not as elevated as they might be, tell you, just write your contract and the world will conform. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. So we write that contract out and then we shake it at the universe like this. And then someday somebody says, is there any signature but yours on that contract? We sort of held it up to God and imagined he was going to sign it. But he has one contract for us, and that contract is really simple. You will be free. You will be free of absolutely everything that limits you. We don't put that on our contract because we literally cannot imagine a joy so profound, a courage so limitless, a freedom so enormous that we are like that little spider running around. Swamiji was telling a story about a disciple of Master who was extremely determined that he wanted an experience of cosmic consciousness, and he kept agitating one of the other disciples who had the power to give it to him. Give me this experience. And finally that advanced disciple said to the other, he said, if you had a taste of that kind of ecstasy, you wouldn't be able to stand your life anymore. Isn't that hard for us to understand? And then when God says, you really are going to have it. You really are going to have bliss. But first you have to let go of this. And you have to let go of this. And you have to let go of this. And you have to open your heart bigger than you ever knew your heart could open. And in the process of doing that, what happens when you start trying to stretch something that's tight? It hurts, doesn't it? It hurts. We think something is happening that is not good for us. Mary Magdalene watched Jesus be crucified. She was at the base of the cross. She watched him die. I mean, who can imagine anything worse? This man was everything to her. He'd rescued her from a life of total despair and had given her a joy beyond what she could imagine. Then she watches him die. And she waits for him to do something about it, because she has absolute faith that he could have moved heaven and earth in that moment. But he didn't. And how many times in our lives, when our hearts are being asked to stretch and we feel it will break, it has broken, how can it stretch any farther? And then the pressure gets worse. We think the answer to our prayers is, oh, God is going to make it easy. Why should he? Why should you let your child just play with her little tea set forever? There she's 34 years old. She's still playing with her little tea set. When one of my friends was having difficulty, her son did not want to be potty trained. And she said, don't you want to be a big boy? And he said, no, I love being a baby. I said, I've never known of anyone who went to college without being potty trained, I said to her. So it's probably going to work out. You don't have to worry. And in fact, it worked out very well, But God is not going to leave us. He's going to keep pulling like that. And so Mary Magdalene thought, I believe in him. I pray for him. Where is the miracle? And she defined for God what the miracle was supposed to be. The miracle was she was supposed to be spared. It was not supposed to happen like this. I've written my own contract. This is what it is. But Jesus said, no, it's not going to happen that way. Not because there was less in her future, but because there was more than she could ever imagine. And that's all of us. That's our lives. That's our multiple incarnations. Sometimes it comes to fruition in one lifetime. Sometimes we die in the middle of the story. Sometimes people around us die in the middle of the story. And we think we cannot live through this. But we do. And then if we keep the faith. Swamiji points out something so important about the whole story of the crucifixion. Because that same night, Jesus appeared to all the disciples, and the disciples were gathered together. And this is a point that Swami it's so simple that you might miss it. They still had faith. They had no idea what was happening, but they still had faith. So they came together. Because they knew the power was with others who believed. And so they were gathered together rather than losing faith and abandoning one another. And then the door opened and Jesus walked in. Just as Swami said, not a vision, not a cloud. He just walked in. And he appeared on multiple times. And many times he would cook food and they would share food. And it would seem like such an odd thing to do. But he was saying, nothing is greater than the power of God. And nothing is greater than the power of God in you. And here I am, among you, as the living proof of that. That's a story for all of us. Every dark step that we take, every time God says, you think you have joy now, let me show you what your heart is really capable of. I will take you through the fire to the joy on the other side. We think of Mary Magdalene, we think of Jesus, we think of all those disciples. Peace be with you, Jesus said. Have no fear. The world may torment you, Jesus said. But here's the good news. I have conquered the world. And in our love for him, he'll take us with him. God bless.